Pull up a chair and dim the light. Leave your worries at the door tonight. No need to whisper, no need to hide. We're all chasing shadows side by side. Southern moon and candle flame. Every ghost has another name. Haunted halls and forgotten dreams. Nothing's ever quite what it seems. Old photographs and dusty frames. Everybody's got stories they can't explain. Somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, wonder waits for those who see. Did you hear it? Did you see? Tell me what you believe. Was it fate? Was it fear? Or something drawing you near? Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Haunted mansions dressed in lace. Footsteps echo through empty space. Vampire myths and whispered lore. 100 secrets behind one door. Disney ghosts and phantom brides. Truth and fiction intertwined. The things we fear, the things we seek, have a funny way of making us believe. True crime headlines and unsolved names. The monsters hiding in familiar frames. The world is stranger than we know, and that's exactly why we go. Stories passed from friend to friend. Questions without easy ends. Somewhere between doubt and faith, we keep searching anyway. Tell me your stories, tell me your fears. Tell me the things you've carried for years. What's in the darkness? What have you seen? Tell me what keeps you wondering. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. Old legends pass through lullabies. Take my hand and lose the fear. Wonder's always welcome here. Curiosity after dark, where restless hearts belong. Searching shadows for a spark, finding wonder in the unknown. Maybe monsters wear familiar faces. Maybe angels leave no traces. Maybe every legend starts with someone asking, what if? Maybe myths and memories pass through generations quietly. Maybe truth is stranger still, waiting just beyond the hill. Maybe the things that keep us awake are the questions we were born to chase. Maybe wonder never dies, it just opens different eyes. So tell me what haunts you. Tell me what fascinates you. Tell me the stories you swore were true. Tell me what made you look twice. We'll talk about ghosts and graveyards, about creatures hidden in folklore, about the darkness in humanity and the beauty of not knowing. No judgment here, no need to convince anyone. You don't have to have the answers, just curiosity. Curiosity after dark, where we wander through the strange. Every question leaves a mark. Nothing ever stays the same. Ghost stories under midnight skies. The legends pass through lullabies. another story waiting to be told. Welcome to Curiosity After Dark.
Okay. So I'm not gonna have my thing on today. So I'm just gonna cut that off. Alright. So hello everybody. And welcome to the newest episode of Curiosity After Dark. Hello, Flamingo. Alright, so tonight we're going to be discussing something very interesting to me. So the past few episodes we've been spending our time in worlds of folklore, mythology, superstitions, hauntings, and the supernatural. We've discussed vampires, we've discussed the Haunted Mansion, we've looked at these kinds of stories people tell when they're trying to make sense of fear and death and things that just refuse to stay buried. Even when those stories are dark, there's usually a layer of distance between us and the subject, right? A vampire is a legend. A ghost story is a story. A haunted house may be rooted in tragedy, but it still lives in that strange place between history and myth. Tonight, we're stepping into something else entirely. This is going to be Curiosity After Dark's first true crime episode. And I want to say this at the beginning because I think it matters. True crime occupies a very strange place in modern culture. On one hand, it can be fascinating in the way that all history is fascinating. It gives us a window into psychology, criminal investigations, cultural fears, and the systems that fail to stop dangerous people before they hurt others. On the other hand, true crime is never just a puzzle. Behind every case are real victims, real families, real children, and real grief. It is very easy, especially with older cases, to get pulled into a spectacle of the thing and forget that the people at the center of it were not characters in a novel, they were human beings. And that is especially true tonight. Because if I were going to pick any figure in American criminal history to do our very first true crime episode, there's only one choice. H.H. Holmes. Now, I know that sounds like a dramatic choice, but honestly, I stand by it. If someone asked me to name the most historical serial killer I find most fascinating, not admirable, not sympathetic, not impressive, just fascinating, Holmes would be at the very top of the list every single time. Not because he has the highest victim count, not because I think he was some criminal mastermind operating at a level no one else could understand, and definitely not because I think the man deserves the kind of weird romanticization that true crime culture sometimes tries to hand out like candy. He fascinates me because his story feels impossible. The deeper you dig into H.H. Holmes, the less it sounds like a real person's biography, and the more it sounds like a horror writer got drunk, locked themselves in a room with a pile of 19th century newspapers, and decided to invent the most absurd villain they could think of. A charming doctor, a con artist, a fraudster, a man with multiple wives, multiple identities, and a habit of leaving town whenever debts, responsibilities, or inconvenient questions start piling up. A man linked to missing women, insurance schemes, suspicious business deals, and one of the most infamous buildings in true crime history. A man who has, over the years, also been linked to dozens of extra murders, countless disappearances, and, because apparently the man does not have enough going on, speculation that he could have been Jack the Ripper. At some point, the story stops sounding real. But yet it is. At least part of it is. That is one of the reasons Holmes remains such a fascinating figure more than a century after his death. In a lot of ways, there are two H.H. Holmes. There's the historical Holmes, the real man who was born Hermer Webster Mudgett, in New Hampshire, studied medicine, moved to Chicago, manipulated nearly everybody around him, and then eventually was executed in 1896. Then there's the legendary Holmes. The homes of haunted attractions, documentaries, ghost tours, Halloween specials, conspiracy threads, and true crime rabbit holes. The Holmes that built a murder hotel specifically designed to kill people. The Holmes who murdered hundreds of victims. The Holmes who somehow operated a death maze in the middle of Chicago while the entire city was distracted by the 1893 World's Fair. The Holmes who depended on which theory you find at 2 in the morning when you should absolutely be asleep, might also have been secretly wandering around London as Jack the Ripper. And that really is what makes Holmes such a perfect subject for Curiosity After Dark. He sits right there at the crossroads of everything this show already loves to talk about: history, mystery, urban legend, psychology, and cultural fear. The way a real human can be over time becomes something larger than life. Because Holmes was not just a killer. He became a story. A ghost story almost. A modern American boogeyman wrapped in mustache wax and a medical degree. But before we get to the castle, before we get to the women who disappeared, before we get to Chicago and the World's Fair and the insurance scams and the accomplice that should have been paid if Holmes wanted to keep his freedom just a little longer, we have to go back to the beginning. Because before he was H.H. Holmes, he was simply Hermit Webster Mudgett. And the question that haunts almost every true crime story is the same one that haunts this one. Who was he before he became the monster everyone remembers? Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. The date matters because it places Holmes in a very specific America, one that looked almost nothing like the one we live in now. The Civil War had just begun a month earlier. Abraham Lincoln was in the White House. The telephone did not exist. Electricity was still a novelty. Automobiles were decades away. The average American could never travel very far from the community they were born. This is not just historical flavor. It matters because one of the defining features of Holmes' adult life would be his ability to disappear, reinvent himself, and manipulate the fact that information moves slowly. Today, if someone wanted to vanish, it is difficult. Bank records exist. Digital footprints exist. Phone records exist. Cameras exist. Social media exists. Even if a person tried to disappear, they would be dragging an entire technological trail behind them. In the 19th century, though, things were very different. A man could leave one town, board a train, arrive in another state, introduce himself under a new name, and begin building an entirely new life. For most people, that possibility represented freedom and reinvention. For Holmes, it became a weapon. By most accounts, Holmes did not grow up in absolute chaos. His family was not wealthy, but they were respectable. His father, Levi Horton Mudgett, worked as a farmer and a tradesman. His mother, Theodette, was a deeply religious woman, and the household was shaped by a strict Methodist environment. Many later accounts describe the family as disciplined, rigid, and severe. Some biographies claim that Holmes' father drank heavily and could be abusive. Others suggest that the household was simply stern in a way many 19th century religious households were stern. And this is where we run into the first major problem, with the Holmes story. The further back you go, the murkier everything becomes. Once someone becomes infamous, people start digging through their childhood like they're searching for the villain origin story. Suddenly, every strange thing became a warning sign. Every moment of childhood dishonesty becomes evidence. Every rumor becomes a clue. One of the most repeated stories in Holmes' childhood is that the other boys forced him into a doctor's office and made him confront a human skeleton because they knew he was afraid of it. According to the story, the experience did not traumatize him in the way they expected. Instead, it fascinated him, sparking a lifelong interest in anatomy and death. Hey, Deku. It's a compelling story. It's also one that historians have never been fully able to verify because it's a he said kind of thing. And that is something I want to keep reminding us throughout this episode. Holmes' life is filled with stories that sound almost too perfect. Stories that fit the legend beautifully. Stories that make excellent documentaries. But a story being dramatically satisfying does not make it historically true. What does appear to be true is that Holmes was highly intelligent. He performed well in school and showed a strong aptitude for science and medicine. Unlike many of the criminals who later become infamous for instability or social dysfunction, Holmes appears to have thrived in structured environments. He was educated, he was articulate, he understood how to present himself well. And I think that is one of the most unsettling things about him. Holmes was not a man who failed at life and then lashed out. He was not someone who could not function in society. He understood society. He understood systems. He understood authority. And perhaps most importantly, he understood how easily people place trust in the appearance of competence. As he entered adulthood, that talent only sharpened. In 1878, at the age of 17, Holmes married Clara Lovering. The marriage produced a son, and for a moment it looked like the beginning of a conventional life. But even here, before the murders, before Chicago, before the legend, we can already see the pattern begin to form. Holmes drifted. Responsibilities became optional. Promises became flexible. Debts accumulated. Commitments disappeared the moment they became inconvenient. If a situation no longer benefited Holmes, Holmes left. If a relationship required something from him, Holmes withdrew. It is tempting to treat the murders as a dramatic transformation in his life, but the truth is more disturbing than that. The murders were not a sudden change in character. They were an escalation of traits that have already been there for years. Holmes did not begin as a killer. He began as a man who viewed other people as tools. Once someone starts seeing human beings as useful only for what they can provide, money, sex, status, security, convenience, it does not take much for the next step to become imaginable. My bad. In 1882, Holmes enrolled in the University of Michigan Medical School. This detail matters because one of the easiest mistakes people make with Holmes is assuming he was a fraud pretending to be a doctor. He wasn't. He was legitimately educated. He attended the lectures, he studied the anatomy, he worked with cadavers, and earned a medical degree. The disturbing thing is not that Holmes played at being a doctor. The disturbing thing was he actually was one. Medical education in the late 19th century exposed students to death in ways most ordinary people never encountered. Cadavers were a common teaching tool. Anatomy labs were places where bodies were dissected and studied in detail. For most physicians, that knowledge became a way to heal. For Holmes, it appears to have become something else entirely. During medical school, Holmes was later suspected of participating in insurance fraud schemes involving cadavers. The exact details are still debated, but the allegations follow a familiar pattern. A body would be acquired, disfigured, or manipulated enough to complicate identification, and then presented as a victim of an accident so the insurance payout would be collected. Now, I need to be careful here because not every version of these early schemes is equally well documented. The broader point, though, is clear enough. Long before Holmes became associated with murder, he had already discovered the power of fraud. He had already learned that death could be profitable. He had already learned that if you understood the paperwork, authority, and human trust enough, you can make an astonishing amount of trouble disappear beneath a respectable surface. And this is why I keep coming back to the idea that Holmes, at his core, was a con man first. Money runs through every phase of his story. Fraud runs through every phase of his story. Manipulation runs through every phase of the story. And the more successful these scams became, the more Holmes learned the most dangerous lesson a man like him could possibly learn: that consequences were negotiable. By the time he left medical school, Holmes had already built the foundations of the man he would become. He had learned how to appear respectable. He had learned how to exploit trust. He had learned how profitable deception could be, and he had learned that if you were charming enough, confident enough, and willing to leave town at the right moment, you could get away with a shocking amount. All Holmes needed now was a city large enough to let him scale up. He found that city in Chicago. By the time that Herman Mudgett arrived in Chicago in the mid-1880s, he was no longer just an intelligent young doctor with shaky moral compass. He was already a practiced liar, a serial fraudster, and a man who learned to weaponize respectability. Chicago did not create these instinctions. They did not create these instinctions. Or these instincts. My bad. I can't read my own notes. Chicago did not create these instincts. Chicago gave them room to grow. This was a city exploding with possibilities. Railroads connected it to the rest of the country. Industry was booming. Neighborhoods were expanding rapidly. New businesses opened constantly. People arrived every day looking for work, opportunity, and reinvention. In a city like that, strangers could vanish into a crowd. A man could build a new identity for himself because there was always new people to deceive and new opportunities to exploit. Holmes soon found work in the Eaglewood neighborhood at a drugstore owned by Dr. E.S. Holton and his wife Elizabeth. And now here is where we run into one of the first major stories in Holmes' Chicago life that sits in an uneasy space between rumor and fact. Popular retellings often claim that Holmes charmed the Holtons, took control of the business, and then somehow arranged for them to disappear. In some versions, Dr. Holton dies. In others, Elizabeth refuses to sell and then later vanishes. The story is dark, suspicious, and perfectly suited to the Holmes legend. The problem is that historians have never been able to firmly prove that Holmes murdered the Holtons. And there is evidence suggesting Elizabeth Holton lived for years after Holmes took over the pharmacy. So if you came into this episode hoping for a neat little "and then he killed the owners and took their store" origin story, history unfortunately is here to ruin the fun. But even if Holmes did not murder the Holtons, the pharmacy still matters enormously because it gave him exactly what he needed: a foothold in Chicago, a business, a respectable public image, and an access to a community that would trust him. This is one of the things that makes Holmes so infuriating to study. Again and again, he is handed opportunities because he looks the part. He is educated. He is articulate. He dresses well. He appears calm and competent. He does not look like danger. He looks like success. And once again, somehow, it works. From the pharmacy, Holmes began expanding his operations. He purchased a vacant lot across the street and started constructing the building that would eventually become known as the Murder Castle. But it is important not to rush there too quickly because the castle did not emerge fully formed as a Gothic nightmare. It was built over time in stages while Holmes was simultaneously running businesses, cultivating relationships, seducing women, and deepening the pattern of fraud and manipulation that would define the rest of his life. And this is where the women in Holmes' life become absolutely central to the story. The earliest and most important was Julia Smythe Connor. Julia was married to Ned Connor, who worked for Holmes and was at one point involved in a jewelry business within the building. Julia, Ned, and their daughter Pearl lived in rooms there, which meant Holmes was not simply a distant employer. He was embedded in their daily lives. Over time, Holmes began an affair with Julia. Ned and Julia's marriage deteriorated, and Ned eventually left the business and separated from Julia, but Julia remained behind with Pearl. That matters because Holmes' relationships with women were never just romantic entanglements. They were systems of control. He did not merely seduce women. He inserted himself into their lives so completely that their finances, reputation, living arrangements, and futures became tangled up with his. He isolated them. He made himself necessary. He made himself trustworthy. Then, in late 1891, Julia and Pearl vanished. Holmes later claimed that Julia died during an abortion and that Pearl was also killed, though he told different stories to different people at different times. That inconsistency is one of the signatures of Holmes' life. He always had an explanation, but the explanation changed depending on what was useful in the moment. To some, Julia had gone away. To others, she had died. To still others, the details remained just vague enough to avoid follow-up questions. Pearl Connor, a child, disappeared alongside her mother and was never seen again. I think this is the most unsettling thing about Holmes. It was never a dramatic scene. There's not always a public discovery of violence. Sometimes people just simply stopped existing, and Holmes calmly explained them away. Then came Emmeline Cigrand. Emmeline was a young woman from Indiana who came to Chicago and took a job with Holmes as a stenographer. She was educated, ambitious, and by all accounts trusted him. Holmes courted her. He may have promised marriage. He certainly appears to have encouraged the belief that she had a future with him. Then, in December of 1892, Emmeline disappeared. Once again, Holmes had a story. He had told people that she had married and moved away. Letters were reportedly sent to reassure family and friends. This detail is incredibly important because it reveals just how complete Holmes' manipulations could be. He did not simply remove women from his life. He continued controlling the narrative afterwards. He understood that if a family believed their daughter had chosen to leave, if friends believed she had started a new life elsewhere, suspicion would fade. He wasn't just making people disappear. He was rewriting their endings. After Emmeline came Minnie Williams, and Minnie is crucial because she represents the point where Holmes' romantic manipulation and financial opportunism fully merge. Minnie was a young woman from Texas with property and inheritance prospects. Holmes courted her, convinced her to transfer property rights to him, and likely saw her as not just a romantic target, but a financial asset. And because Holmes is Holmes, one woman was apparently not enough chaos. Minnie's sister, Nanny Williams, also entered the picture. And just like Julia, just like Pearl, and just like Emmeline, they disappeared. Again, Holmes had explanations. Again, the women were said to have gone elsewhere. Again, the story becomes foggy enough for him to keep moving. This is where the comparison of Ted Bundy starts to make sense to me, not because the crimes were identical, but because both men understood the extraordinary power of appearing safe. Holmes did not need to rely primarily on brute force. His first weapon was trust. He looked like a doctor, a businessman, a respectable man with plans, ambitions, and a future to offer. Women trusted him because he gave them every reason to, and then he used that trust against them. That, to me, is scarier than any trapdoor. While Holmes was manipulating the women around him, the building across the pharmacy began to take shape. The building that later became famous as the Murder Castle was, on paper, a mixed-use building. The ground floor contained retail spaces. The upper floors held offices, storage rooms, and apartments or guest rooms. Construction stretched on for years. Holmes hired and fired contractors constantly, often before they could fully understand the layout. He changed the plans frequently. Certain rooms were built for very specific purposes. Some spaces were oddly isolated. Some hallways were confusing. Some rooms were windowless. There were hidden areas, chutes, and a basement fitted with suspicious equipment. Now, this is where I need to make another distinction between the historical castle and the legendary castle. The legendary murder castle is the version that most people know. It's a labyrinth of gas chambers, soundproof rooms, trapdoors, hidden staircases, torture chambers, secret passages, acid vats, crematoriums, and architectural nightmares. It feels less like a real building and more like a haunted attraction designed by someone who said, what if a hotel also had a murder-themed escape room from hell? The historical reality is a lot more restrained than that. Still disturbing, still strange, and still suspicious, but not necessarily as theatrical as the newspapers made it sound after Holmes was arrested. And that matters, because Holmes lived during the golden age of sensational journalism. Newspapers loved scandal. They loved horror. They loved monsters. And once Holmes was caught, the castle became irresistible. Every strange room turned into a death chamber. Every architectural oddity became evidence of unimaginable evil. Some of these claims were likely grounded in truth. Others were probably exaggerated. Some may have been entirely invented. But if we strip away the most dramatic details, what remains is still chilling. Holmes appears to have designed parts of that building to confuse, isolate, and control people inside it. That alone is enough. Then, in 1893, Chicago hosted the World Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair. This is one of the reasons Holmes' story has endured so powerfully, because the setting is almost too perfect. The White City was a glittering monument to modernity and progress. Millions of visitors poured into Chicago to see dazzling architecture, electric lights, new inventions, and a vision of America's future. Tourists needed lodging. Young women came seeking work. Strangers filled the city. And in the shadow of that shining spectacle sat Holmes' strange building in Eaglewood. On one side, the White City, modern, brilliant, full of promise. On the other, Holmes, seducing women, running scams, disappearing people, and building a reputation that would outlive him by more than a century. It is no wonder why later writers were obsessed with the symbolism of it. Holmes became a shadow cast by progress, the darkness behind the gleaming future. That is why The Devil in the White City became such a powerful title. It captures the contrast perfectly. By the time the fair ended, Holmes had spent years refining his methods. He had manipulated women, stolen property, deceived creditors, evaded consequences, and convinced himself that he was smarter than everyone around him. He also became deeply comfortable with the fact that if something or someone stood in his way, they could simply be removed. And because Holmes was Holmes, he eventually made the same mistake that overconfident criminals make. He pushed too far. By the early 1890s, Holmes had spent years proving to himself that he could get away with almost everything. He had lied to wives, seduced women, stolen property, manipulated employees, dodged creditors, exploited investors, and built an entire life on the assumption that if he looked respectable enough, no one would look too closely at the damage left behind him. And that is what makes his downfall so fitting. H. Holmes was not ultimately brought down by the castle. He was not exposed by someone who discovered a hidden room and dramatically gasped in Victorian. He was brought down by him being greedy, and he cheated the wrong man. That man was Benjamin Pitzel. Pitzel was a carpenter who was sometimes an associate of Holmes. And like so many people in Holmes' orbit, he became entangled in the web of promises, schemes, and opportunities that was never going to end well. Holmes had already been involved in insurance fraud, and together the two men planned a scheme in which Benjamin would fake his own death so that the insurance payout would be collected. Holmes would then help orchestrate the fraud, and then the money would be divided. And if you're listening to this and thinking maybe I should not commit insurance fraud with H. Holmes, congratulations, you're already making better decisions than Benjamin. Only, Holmes never had any intention of splitting anything. In September 1894, Benjamin was found dead in Philadelphia. Rather than staging a fake death with a substitute body, Holmes appears to have simply murdered him and used the real corpse to collect the money. It was cleaner, simpler, and more profitable. But if the story ended there, that was already horrifying enough. The true horror of this is what he did next. After Benjamin's death, Holmes turned his attention to his family, particularly Benjamin's widow, Carrie, and the children. Holmes convinced Carrie that Benjamin was still alive and in hiding as part of the scheme. He presented himself as a helpful friend, the man managing the details, the man who knew how to protect the family until the situation was resolved. Carrie, grieving and desperate, trusted him. That trust gave Holmes access to the children, Alice, Nellie, Howard. This, to me, is the point in the story where any temptation to treat Holmes as merely a fascinating rogue or a theatrical villain would die completely. Because whatever rumors grew around the castle, whatever the newspapers exaggerated, whatever legends later writers added, the Pitzel children were real. Their fear was real. Their trust was real. And their deaths were real. Holmes moved the children across multiple cities, separating them from their mother and from one another at different times, while continuing to reassure Carrie through letters and false promises. He had told her Benjamin was alive. He told her reunions were coming. He told her whatever he needed to tell her in order to maintain control. Meanwhile, the children were entirely dependent on him. Howard was murdered first in Indianapolis. Alice and Nellie were taken to Toronto, where Holmes murdered them and hid their bodies in the cellar of a rented house. When their remains were discovered, the case transformed from a sensational fraud story to one of the most horrifying murder cases in the century. The Pitzel children strip away any illusion that Holmes was merely a clever con man who escalated too far. There is no glamour here. There is no gothic mystique. No dark charisma, just cruelty. And ironically, it was Holmes' greed in the Peitzel scheme that finally unraveled everything. One of the men connected to the insurance scam was Marin Hedgepeth, a outlaw Holmes had met briefly while in prison. Holmes was had promised Hedgepeth a cut of the money in exchange for helping connect him with a lawyer. After Holmes collected the insurance payout and failed to pay him, Hedgepeth did what Holmes should have realized he would do. He talked. And honestly, that is something almost absurd about the fact that after all the women, all the fraud, oh my gosh. All the fake identities, all the disappearances, the suspicious building, the lies, the murders, the one thing that would finally push Holmes towards exposure was essentially he didn't pay the guy he was doing the crime with. There's a lesson. It's not a good lesson, but it's a lesson. Hedgepeth's information helped direct investigators towards Holmes and the insurance fraud. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894, and once the investigation deepened, the lies began collapsing. Detective Frank Geyer of Philadelphia became one of the most important figures in this case, painstakingly tracing Holmes' movements and searching for the missing children across multiple cities. Geyer's investigation is one of the most compelling parts of the entire Holmes case because it reminds us how much criminal investigation depended on persistence before modern technology. No digital records, no databases, no surveillance footage, just interviews, train schedules, rental records, and relentless legwork. Geyer's work led to the discovery of Howard's remains in Indianapolis and Alice and Nellie's bodies in Toronto. At that point, whatever uncertainty remained about Holmes' capacity for murder vanished. He was tried for the murder of Benjamin and convicted and sentenced to death. On May 7th, 1896, sorry, I keep getting things confused. On May 7th, 1896, H.H. Holmes was executed by hanging in Philadelphia. Even then, Holmes could not resist one final dramatic flourish. He reportedly requested that his coffin be buried 10 feet deep and encased in concrete, supposedly because he feared grave robbers or body snatchers. Whether that request came from vanity, superstition, or one last attempt to control the spectacle of his own death, it was entirely in character. But the execution would not end the story. In many ways, it ensured that the legend would survive. After Holmes' death, the mythology around him only grew. The castle burned and was later demolished, but its destruction almost made the legend stronger. With the physical structure gone, imagination rushed in to fill the gaps. Every hallway became darker. Every hidden room became more sinister. Every rumor became more easy to believe. Over time, Holmes stopped being merely a historical criminal and became something closer to an American boogeyman. This is the Holmes that most people encounter. The Holmes of documentaries, of the Holmes of ghost tours, the Holmes of haunted attractions, the Holmes of true crime podcasts, internet threads, and pop culture retellings. The Holmes who inspired James Patrick March in American Horror Story Hotel, where the historical facts are less important than the larger myth. The elegant killer, the strange hotel, the hidden hallways, and the violence tucked behind beautiful walls. And of course, once a man becomes one of history's celebrity monsters, people start attaching every possible theory to him, including Jack the Ripper. The theory that Holmes might have been Jack the Ripper usually hinges on the fact that Holmes's whereabouts during certain periods were not perfectly documented, combining his medical training and capacity for violence. Supporters of the theory point to his intelligence, his known use of oh my god, I cannot say this word, his known use of false identities, and the general fact that once you already have a charming doctor serial killer, people start seeing him everywhere. The problem is evidence. There is no strong contemporary evidence linking Holmes to the Whitechapel murders. There is no reliable documentation placing him in London at the right time in a way that proves involvement. Most serious historians reject the theory, and I think they are right to do so. But the theory still matters, not because I think it's true, because it tells us something about his afterlife in pop culture. People do not wonder whether random 19th century fraudsters were secretly Jack the Ripper. They wonder about Holmes because Holmes became one of history's favorite monsters. At some point, the real man ceased to be enough. The legend demanded expansion. And maybe that is the best way to understand why H.H. Holmes continues to fascinate us. There is the real Holmes, the man who lied, cheated, manipulated, seduced, defrauded, and murdered. And then there's the legendary Holmes, the dark fairy tale that grew around him after his death. The real Holmes is horrifying enough. He betrayed women who trusted him. He stole from the vulnerable. He manipulated a grieving mother and murdered her children. Nothing about that requires gas chambers or trapdoors or London's theories to be disturbing. But the legend persists because Holmes arrived at the perfect moment for myth-making. He looked respectable. He sounded educated. He moved through one of the most dramatic settings in 19th century America. He built a bizarre building in the shadow of the World's Fair. When he was finally caught, the details were so awful that the public never really let him go. In the end, I think that's what makes Holmes such a compelling choice for our first true crime episode. He is not simply a serial killer. He is a study in trust, a study in greed, a study in manipulation, a study in how easily charm can disguise cruelty. And most of all, he is a study in the way history turns people into stories. Herman Webster Mudgett died in 1896. H.H. Holmes never did. And that is going to be the end of this episode today. Alright. Thank y'all so much for being around and listening to our first true crime podcast, our first true crime episode. Next week, I do believe we're going to go with the White House and the small little history about the White House for our 4th of July special. Well, it's not going to be 4th of July, it's going to be July 2nd, but still, I'm going to do something special because, 4th of July is next week. So, anyway, thank you guys for being around, and I appreciate y'all, and I will see y'all later. Bye!